Okay, so let's continue to talk about the Protestant Reformation. So after Martin Luther started, what happened is that other people realized that they could do what Martin Luther had done. They didn't have to stay under papal authority. They could start their own churches. They could worship in the way that they wanted to. So throughout Europe, that's what started to happen. Christianity began to branch out, and that's where we get all of the different churches that we have today. Now, the figure in the middle, this is King Henry. And King Henry has an interesting story. When the Protestant Reformation was going on in Europe, King Henry said that it was bad, that all these new Protestants, right? So if you're ever curious about the term Protestant, what you can do is you can look at the root, just like we did before. So here we have protest. Just like before, we had reform. So this lets us know what Martin Luther was about. He was protesting how greedy the church had become, and he wanted it to reform. Martin Luther, it was never his intent to start a new Christian church. That wasn't what he wanted to do. So, King Henry said that the Protestant Reformation was bad, that everybody should just stick with the Pope. But then he began an extended confrontation with Rome that many people are familiar with. He was married at the time, and he was having trouble getting legitimate, of course the key word there is legitimate, male heir to the throne. He had some illegitimate male children, but that wasn't getting it done. He needed a legitimate male, but his wife was only giving him daughters, so he wanted to divorce his wife, and the Pope said, no, you can't do that. So then you might have heard that. Yes, that's right. He chopped off the head of his wife, and the Pope heard about that, said, you really can't do that. Can't chop the head off your wife just because she's giving you daughters and you want a son. So Henry ignored the Pope, and he was excommunicated. And this was perfectly fine for King Henry VIII, because what he did then is that he started his own church, and today we call that the Church of England. Now, this is Thomas More over here, and he was arguing against King Henry, what he was doing with his divorces and remarriages, and he refused to recognize King Henry VIII's authority over the Pope. So that sets off in a confrontation between King Henry and Thomas More, and you might be able to guess what happens if you disagree with the king. That's right. He was put to death for saying that what was going on was bad. He should have stayed with the church. So then we have another church that comes about, which is the Church of England. Now, before we talked about, and we just were using this term, the church. Today, what was formerly just called the church is today called the Catholic Church. So this is where the story of how we get all the different divisions in Christianity, all of the different Christian denominations, either Catholic or Protestant. And it started just a little over 500 years ago during the Protestant Reformation. Again, all of this is part of the Renaissance. So literature is part of the flowering as well. Drama experiences a tremendous growth during this period. For example, in London, the Globe Theatre is built that could seat 2,000 people, which is a pretty big deal, because what this shows, it shows the growth of literacy, education, and people have free time and they're interested to go out and see a play. It's really interesting. Also, the sonnet becomes the dominant poetic form. It started in Italy and then traveled throughout Europe as people started to interact with each other and go from city to city and take all these ideas and move them about. So some of the thematic characteristics. The first one, interest in the world. Before, when we were in the medieval period, the overarching concern was for salvation and the afterlife. But now, the here and now is being emphasized. Interest in the world. Perfectibility. Before, during the medieval period, people believed that we were fixed, that as we were born, that's part of God's plan, that we weren't supposed to, think about perfection or bettering ourselves. But now, during the Renaissance, that's a part of life. This idea of bettering yourself, working towards perfection. And that this gives us an important movement, which is humanism. Humanism was an intellectual movement. It's still around today, by the way, incredibly influential, that is concerned with human rather than religious values. Before, when we were with the medieval period, right, that was all about what? Religious values, right? What do we see again? Concern for what? Life hereafter, and for what? Salvation. Reformation, as we just talked about, especially with the Protestant Reformation. This gives us all of the different native tongue editions of the Bible. So by native tongue, what that refers to is the Bible's translated out of Latin into German, French, English, right? All of these different peoples got the Bible in their own language to read. Nationalism. During the Renaissance, this was a time of optimism, patriotism, confidence. And because of the travel that was going on during this time, different styles, for example, like we just touched upon with the sonnet, would be shared, adopted, and changed. So we have all of this movement, all of this growth going on after, over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years in the medieval period, everything being the same. Now we start to see lots and lots of growth, lots and lots of changes. Really exciting time, not just in literature, but in the world.